The vice presidential debate between Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance wrapped up late Tuesday night, with many viewers and pundits saying they felt refreshed at the civility between the two candidates. So who won, and what does it mean for the election in November? To break down the latest polling numbers, we're going to on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science for Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Jumping right into this, I want to turn our attention to a CBS News poll overnight that showed viewers thought Vance did slightly better than Walz. Vance, of course, is a more experienced debater, but about 17% said it was a tie. What do you make of those polling numbers, and does it signify a party split?
Look, I think that's probably a little bit good news for Tim Walz, because I think at least the Twitter commentary and what I saw, it looked like J.D. Vance probably did a little bit better than a couple points above Tim Walz. But, you know, the polls say it's tied. I think that's good for both of them. I saw another crosstab out of a similar overnight poll that said both candidates had their favorability move up. You know, J.D. Vance had more favorability room to grow. And so I think by and large, it's a good thing for both candidates and probably slightly better for J.D. Vance coming out of this.
And Scott, one question we were asking going into this debate was, how much do these vice presidential debates actually matter? So do you think it will have any kind of impact, on independent and undecided voters?
I really don't think so. And the data point I'm drawing on to make that conclusion is we look at the first presidential debate. And, you know, you and I have talked about it over the last couple of weeks. There hasn't been any significant poll movement for either candidate post last presidential debate. So I can't see this VP debate really moving the needle if the presidential one didn't really move it.
So a lot of observers, particularly Republicans, said Vance performed very well. And while he gained some favorability compared to before the debate, according to an overnight CNN poll, he's not necessarily outpacing Walz, who, despite his rocky performance, managed to gain favorability. Where do you think Walz is gaining that support from?
I think it's a lot of, for both these candidates, you know, this is their first time on the national stage. And so they're gaining their popularity simply by putting themselves out there and probably shoring up supporters that were probably going to be supportive of them in the past. You know, I think that's pretty telling that J.D. Vance moved up the most in terms of numbers, but Tim Walz is higher overall, and you know, that's what we saw before the debate. And I think it's interesting we see it after the debate. And I don't think that's going to change much on the presidential level or change a whole lot in the states, the battleground states.
So we see these snap post-debate polls. They're conducted in less than 24 hours. They're taken from, people who obviously watch the debate in real time. So how accurate are these post-debate polls? And do you think we'll necessarily see them reflected in national polls over the next few weeks? I mean, the second presidential debate with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump didn't seem to have much of an impact. And if the vice presidential debate isn't going to have much of an impact on voters, I mean, is this going to be reflected in the polls at all?
Yeah, the overnight polls, they're good entertainment, but to get that methodology right is usually pretty hard. I'm not a huge fan of them. I'm not saying they're complete garbage, but I there's a reason why most campaigns use qualitative assessments, not quantitative assessments like polls, to understand what's going on in focus groups, which is different than a poll. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of them. But look, at the end of the day, whether or not this is going to change the polls, I mean, we'll find out. Ask me again in a week. I'm sure you will ask me again in a week. I just numbers out. 67 million people watched it at the highest point. It was 52 million people. So that's actually a little higher than I thought it was going to be. But again, we haven't seen the polls move a lot in the last month because most people know who these people are. And most of the people who are voting know they're not voting for the VP candidate. They're voting for the top of the ticket. So I think it was good political entertainment, but I don't see it moving the polls a whole lot.
Spoken like a true pollster and data analyst, and I will definitely be asking you this question next week, so let's get ready. I want to shift gears towards the top of the ticket. A new survey from the election handicapper shows Harris with a slight lead in most battleground states, but they're tied in North Carolina, where parts of the state have been decimated by Hurricane Helene. Scott, could the Biden administration's response to the storm help or hurt Harris in the polls?
You know, it could hurt and it could help. I mean, here's the crazy thing. Let me lay it out, the pros and cons for both of it. those polling numbers from a very reputable pollster. Cook Political is very good at this. They partnered with a good GOP and a good Dem firm, so there's not a lot of bias there. Those are closer polls than I expected to see in North Carolina and Georgia. And when you slap on the margin of errors, you can make the case for either candidate winning that state. And so every little bit counts in places like North Carolina and Georgia. The people, are in North Carolina. North Carolina can actually vote now. They could be sitting outside of their hurricane damaged home, returning a ballot here this week. And so their perception of the Biden administration's helping and handling of their situation could definitely translate to something in the polls. Do I think it'll move 5 or 10 points? My guess is not, although we'll have a pretty good idea here in a couple of weeks when we look at it. But even if it only moves it a point or two, based on those polls, that could be the difference maker in both of those states.
So that same poll has Trump ahead in Georgia by 2 points. We know that Georgia was also rocked by Helene. And this week, Trump made a trip to survey the damage in the southern part of the state. So how is the response impacting polling there? I mean, I know that the storm just hit, so I imagine that pollsters haven't really been out in the field that much.
Yeah, if I saw any poll out in the field come out, this week, I'd say it's probably too soon. Look, there's not even electricity in some of these places still. And, there's not a lot of people who they're too busy dealing with their own personal lives than responding to polls. I'd really like to wait another 10 days. And, we got 35 days before the election, so there's not a lot of time. But to get any accurate data out of Georgia or North Carolina, those places, we're going to have to wait a little bit longer. Too many voters are affected by this, and they're not focused on the elections.
Yeah, an interesting update also out of Georgia. The state's Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, praised President Biden's response. We know that Governor Kemp and President Trump have certainly clashed before. Do you think this could reignite their feud? And if it does it once again sort of split the Georgia Republican Party?
Yeah, look, I remember when Hurricane Sandy hit and Chris Christie, hugged Obama when he came out for that. And that was a huge issue among the Republican primary when Christie later ran for president. So, look, Brian Kemp has made a point of being not necessarily 100% Trump supporter, carving his own path. So I'm not surprised he did this. He's also seems to be a pretty savvy political operator. I think he probably calculated what this might mean for him in state. And, he determined that wasn't going to hurt him that much. All that being said it wouldn't surprise me to see Donald Trump go and attack him for this. That's what Donald Trump does. He likes the loyalty, and he's not shy for going after Brian Kemp or anyone who doesn't show that kind of loyalty to him. So, yeah, I could see this becoming a problem over the next week, especially if we're still talking about hurricane damage and who's helping and who's not helping over the next few days.
Yeah, and coupled with this, we of course have that port strike, which is now starting to collide with the coverage of the hurricane, could have some severe economic impact going forward. So we'll be watching for that. So Scott, we are 33 days away from the election. I know that the last time I looked at the decision desk forecasting earlier today, it shows Harris with an edge, but has there been any changes in that forecasting from you?
So I hate to say it, right? We've all, you and I, it's always somewhere between 54 and 57, and it's been pretty steady. That may feel a little bit frustrating, but I think that is just where we're at. And the reason why it's kind of stayed in that range is because every time Donald Trump gets a good poll in Pennsylvania, she gets a good poll in North Carolina. And so the model takes all this into account and projects it out. And so that's why we're kind of stuck where we're at, because both of these candidates are getting good polls, good fundraising numbers, good momentum, but in very different battleground states. And so that's kind of what we see. It's a very slight edge. I would not, at 55%, I would not say that she has a commanding lead. It is an ever so slight advantage for her, and no one should be surprised if Donald Trump pulls it off with this percentage, and no one should be surprised if Harris pulls off. That's how close this race is.
Definitely within the margin of error. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.